Kia ora koutou. My name's Max Harris. I'm involved with a young people's criminal justice group called Just Speak, and I'm really privileged to chair this session. In recent weeks, we've seen a bit of a surge in discussion of issues around children's rights, although that discussion hasn't always been framed in the language of children's rights. The release of the summary of submissions on the Vulnerable Children Green Paper and the release of the report on solutions to child poverty from the Children's Commissioner's Expert Advisory Group have prompted a lot of media comment. And we've had articles in the New Zealand Herald, in the Dominion Post and in the Listener questioning whether there has been a meaningful political response to this policy activity on children's rights. So this background makes now a really perfect time to hear from two very distinguished speakers on the topic of children's rights. And in this session, we'll hear from Professor Anne Smith from the University of Otago College of Education and Judge Peter Bosher, the Principal Family Court Judge. The session's going to run for just over 45 minutes. We'll have two 20-minute presentations from Professor Smith and Judge Bosher, and then 5 minutes for questions. So I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Anne Smith. Anne Smith is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Otago. She was Director of the Children's Issue Centre between 1995 until 2006. She's published a number of research articles and written several books, including Understanding Children's Development. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, has sat on a range of advisory groups and panels, received a number of awards for her work, including a US award in 2009 for her research and advocacy to ensure that the voices of children are heard. She recently wrote a very spirited submission on the Vulnerable Children Green Paper, where she defended the rights of children and young people to participate in policy, and she's also been involved with advocating for children's rights through the Children and Young People Research Cluster at the University of Otago. Please welcome Professor Smith.
Ngā mihi nui a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm not very good at keeping to a 20-minute thing, so I hope timekeeper's going to help me there. But I just wanted to say at the beginning that I've got a paper and that it's on the website, so that I won't have time to elaborate on some of the things I'm saying, but if you want chapter and verse, that paper is there for everyone. So I'm going to just really address three issues in my 20 minutes. And you might be surprised that the rights that I've chosen to talk about are survival, development, education, and non-discrimination. Because I'm usually the one that does all the talking about participation rights, and I'm hoping that Peter Bosher will do that. So I ask whether our children's right to quality early childhood education is under threat, and I ask, is it the best way to target our resources at vulnerable children, priority children called in some reports, rather than providing accessible, affordable services for all? So, definition of rights, claims that are justifiable on legal or moral grounds, and just quickly to go through the ones I wanted to address. First, the right to survival and development, Article 6, the education articles 28 and 29, which are about the right to education and the right to achieve your full potential. Article 2 is about non-discrimination. It's about rights being for all children, regardless of ethnicity, income, gender, disability, whatever. Although the United Nations Convention never actually mentioned early childhood education, that's really what my 20 minutes is going to be focused around. But they did, in 2006, publish a general comment specifically addressed to early childhood education. And there they fully endorsed that rights are for all children, including young children, and they're particularly important for young children because at that stage they can have such a positive impact and also prevent harm. So first of all, survival and development. How are we doing? We're ranked 29th out of 30 countries for child health in 2009. We're in the bottom third of the OECD for most child indicators. Infant mortality is twice that of Iceland. Iceland's the best. But we're much worse when it comes to infant mortality in deprived neighbourhoods. Not sure how they define that, but we're third from the bottom of the OECD there. Only Turkey and Mexico are worse than us. I know you've heard all these statistics a lot, but I just thought, because it does address that right. We've got high rates of child poverty, 1 in 4, that is pretty astonishing. Child injury, pneumonia, whooping cough, and so on. We spend half of the OECD average on early childhood, and that covers the range of services for under 5s. And then I thought, let's just look at education. How are we doing in rights to education? You've got more of a health focus here, but the two concepts are so closely related. Actually, we do incredibly well in education. We're 4th in literacy, 5th in numeracy, 4th in science. I thought you'd be interested to know that, compare that with the UK. The UK is 25th in reading, 28th in maths, and 28th in science. So actually, overall, countries like Finland and I think Japan are above us, but we do incredibly well when you look at the averages. But when you look at how we're doing for the poorest children, the lowest socioeconomic groups, we don't do nearly as well. We are ranked the highest in the OECD for catering for literacy for the lowest income groups. We do pretty well on participation in early childhood education, although you don't know really how long or what intensity that is. Like nearly 95% of our children, before they get to school, have attended an early childhood centre. It's a little lower for Maori and Pacifica, but the rates are really increasing very rapidly for those two groups. And I think in the 10 years from 2000 to 2011, Maori participation increased by 14% and Pacific 9%. So they're actually coming up. And I only make that point because it seems like the government's efforts are all about participation. And what I want to do is give you a message about quality. Interestingly, the Economist Intelligence Unit just did one of those league table things about the quality of early childhood education provision, accessibility, affordability, and New Zealand came 9th out of 45 countries. I have some doubts about the way they measured some of that. So just briefly, I've been a part of a group which has advocated for better, higher quality, more accessible, more affordable early childhood education since, dare I say it, the 70s. And it is something where we've made huge steps forward. I mean, we've heard a lot of very sort of pessimistic stuff, but really, we've really transformed ourselves. We've got better status, we've got recognition, we've got funding, and this is recognised all over the world. New Zealand is a leader in early childhood education. From the start, we've seen you can't separate the caring aspect of an early childhood provision from the education aspect. That is, children's relationships and the warmth of the environment they're in is going to affect what they learn. And we believe in integrated services. Interesting that we've integrated education and care, which, for instance, they don't in Australia. You've still got childcare centres and kindergartens, the so-called education centres. But we haven't really done as well as we ought to have in general, but in integrating health. And I think there's a lot of room to improve there. We've had a strategic plan between 2000 and 2012 that's made a huge impact on the quality of our early childhood education services. Just to go back to that for a moment, we now have something like 70% of all the staff in early childhood centres are qualified. And it was a long, long way from that at the beginning in 2000. So in 10 years, we made huge gains. So what I'm wanting to focus on is what are we doing about quality? Well, it's a complex issue, and there's no one easy way of defining it. We've got to say that it it includes cultural values and goals. For instance, hopefully in New Zealand, one of our goals is about preserving Maori language and culture. And that's not something that's in all the international tables at all, but it's about cultural recognition of cultural identity and promoting culture. But there are some things, and unfortunately the things that are easily measured, like ratio, group size, and training are sometimes the ones that are focused on. But in this case, they're all really important. Like, you cannot provide that process quality, that reciprocal, responsive, warm relationships when you've got far too many children in a huge group and the adults are untrained. So, let me just briefly talk about the evidence about the impact of early childhood education. And there's a lot more in the actual paper there. So, first of all, we know that early childhood education doesn't have the same impact as families themselves. The impact of what goes on in families is much stronger. But there is a lot of evidence to show that if early childhood education links with families, it hugely increases its power. And there is a huge weight of international evidence that there are long-term benefits of participation in quality early childhood education. Now, again, the emphasis on quality. Participation on its own is not enough, because participation in low quality is actually harmful. So just getting kids into early childhood centres is not enough. And it's particularly harmful for children from more risky, disadvantaged, whatever, it's hard to find the word, but basically poor families. So there's no point in increasing participation without maintaining and improving quality. Now, this is a graph from Heckman, the Nobel laureate economist, who actually shows the rates of return on human capital investment at different ages. So actually, I guess what it is saying is that just from a simple economic point of view, it makes sense to invest. Although unfortunately, it's usually 15 or 17 years later when the benefits of that investment are seen, and with a 3-year election cycle, you don't necessarily understand that. The figures are pretty astonishing there. So those are the rates of turn. So we could pour money into helping adolescents, which of course we should, but it doesn't work as well as if we invest in the early years. And there's a quote from Heckman. And I don't necessarily buy the economic line of thinking, but I do buy what he's saying about motivation and the non-cognitive capabilities that are built in the early years. Early learning confers value on acquired skills, we call them dispositions, which leads to self-reinforcing motivation to learn more. So they are sort of lifetime things. They're not about learning letters and numbers. They're a range of non-cognitive skills that have very long-lasting effects if they're acquired in early childhood. And these are just, these came from the Early Childhood Task Force report, some of the benefit-cost ratios. For the very highest program, the Perry Preschool one, it was $16 for every $1 invested. The Chicago Child Parent Center one, which is one I prefer to talk about because it's done in an ordinary public school. The Perry Preschool was a sort of university project. It's done in ordinary public schools in low-income areas in Chicago. The cost benefit was 10.83. And when they measured at the age of 26, there was an 18% return on investment, which is huge. Now, I've come across, in my work on the Early Childhood Task Force, a Swedish economist and sociologist called Esping Anderson, and I really would like the expert group on poverty to look at this stuff because it's really interesting. He actually uses the PISA, those achievement scores for 15-year-olds that I was quoting before, and looks at it on a global basis, and shows that the Nordic countries, for instance, instance, like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they invest in quality, and what they have done is they have managed to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. So they've shown that, for instance, immigrants and other groups that are often very much poorer, that they break that cycle of disadvantage, and where it's gone from poverty has gone from generation to generation, they break that cycle. Also, he argues that cultural capital too is inherited. That's things like knowing how to get the right school, to choose the right school, and make the right choices for your children. And he says that education systems are inherently biased towards the middle class, and I think that's very true in New Zealand. We've got a great system, but it's not equal. One of the figures that really sticks in my head that he quotes is that Denmark, if you're a poor child in Denmark, you achieve 4 times better than if you're a poor child in Germany. And he attributes to this very great investment in early childhood, not just into centre care, but into wraparound services for young children. Now, my big argument is exactly this, that the European Commission said, that universal access is much more beneficial than intervention exclusively targeted at vulnerable groups. Targeting poses huge problems, administrative problems, financial problems. It's difficult to identify the target group. I mean, I think that's going to be a problem, and I think, Nicola, you raised that about the feeding in schools thing. Are you really getting to the right people? And there are other disadvantages which I've listed here. High transaction costs, stigmatization of targeted families, greater gains when all children participate, and we found that in our Competent Children, Competent Learners longitudinal study, that if children are in a mixed age is nice too, but mixed socioeconomic group, they do better than if they're in a group of all poor children. It's true, and this is the third to last bullet point, the thing that governments have grasped on, that participation is more beneficial for it is more beneficial for low socioeconomic children. But that doesn't mean to say that we should only subsidise early childhood education for low-income children. And in fact, the majority of the OECD countries now provide 2 years of universal free early childhood education. At the moment in New Zealand, we have what's called, it used to be called 23 hours. It's now called 20 hours, and that is for all 3 and 4-year-olds. So I am very fearful of some of the things that are happening that are moving us towards targeting. First of all, the Green Paper on Vulnerable Children. It favours identifying the 15%, where'd they get 15% from? The 15% most vulnerable children. For a start, it's dangerous because it constructs children as vulnerable and in deficit. It tends to ignore their resilience and strengths. It actually also forgets that children are almost everyone is vulnerable at some time. I think I worry about some of the assessment stuff, that in trying to meet some rights, then we're violating privacy rights. And the Early Childhood Task Force that I was a member of, and that the poverty report recommends adopting all the recommendations of that report, there was one bit that I really didn't agree with, and that was that they wanted to identify what they call priority children. And if you look carefully at their funding proposals, they're actually, because it's got to be fiscally neutral, so how do you prioritise vulnerable children? You take money away from the rest of what we now have as universal accessible system. So I want to just, I'm running out of time, but I'm getting there. This is I think the last slide. There are some things that are happening that actually we're going backwards. You know, we made progress, we moved forward, we were getting better quality. many different reports recently have recommended better ratios in early childhood education, especially for under 2-year-olds. And they've been ignored and stopped from 2008. There were recommendations to improve these. Qualifications, it's just so much evidence to show that qualified staff provide a better quality of care. The goal of having 100% has been abandoned, and the funding for the 100% qualified staff in early childhood centres has been removed. Now only 80% are expected to be qualified. We have all our professional development programs were cut in 2009. The professional development programs that were focused on implementing our curriculum, Te Whāriki, and our exemplars, learning stories. We had a wonderful scheme that was incredibly cheap. It was about $1 million, where we had best practice projects, and these were being disseminated. That was cut in 2009. We've never had any regulation about group size, which I think is appalling. But in 2011, we can now have centres with 75 children under 1 year and 150 children over 2. So in conclusion, I think we've got to hang on to universal provision. And I'm talking about early childhood education, but I believe it for all services, because that implements children's education, development, survival, and non-discrimination rights. And especially when we've got these hard times, and that we need to be working on improving rather than eroding quality. That, what was the phrase that your other speaker used? I've lost it now. Proportionate universalism seems to me to be exactly right. And we need to actually keep our status as a world leader, and we've been doing very well at some things, but we're going to do a lot worse if that erosion of quality continues.